Thank you for joining us here on France 24 for our special coverage of the commemorations in Germany marking the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was an event which happened on this day, the 9th of November 1989. Those scenes 30 years ago were broadcast across the globe, and it was an event that was followed by the collapse of the communist regime and German reunification less than a year later. Well, leading today's commemorations, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the President of Germany, Michael Müller, the Mayor of Berlin, and also the city's Archbishop, and a host of about 500 official guests. Tomorrow, a number of world leaders will be joining the commemorations there in Berlin, which are already underway. Well, let's get the latest from our correspondent in Berlin, Nick Spicer, who joins us now. Nick, 30 years on since the fall of the Berlin Wall, what does all of this mean to the average German person?
I think a lot of questions are being asked at this particular commemoration. You know, I was here 5 years ago, and people were pretty jubilant. There's a widespread recognition this time, as there was last, that the fall of the wall was an amazing historical event, a bloodless revolution. Let's remember in 1989, there was also the Tiananmen Square massacre when Chinese people were trying to reach for democracy, and it didn't end well. However, this time around, there's a recognition that the ideas of populism and authoritarianism are spreading in the West. To use the words of the American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who was here yesterday, he said, in the afterglow of that proud moment, the West, and all of us, he said, lost our way. And I think we're seeing that in some of the Central European countries that are represented here today, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban talking of a new illiberal democracy in his country, and also concern about the transatlantic alliance, Donald Trump questioning the utility of NATO and the European Union, and then just the domestic problems in Germany are causing Germans to ask themselves questions about what it all means. The rise of the far-right Alternative for Germany party, which is the #2 political force in this country, scored well in the most recent regional elections in eastern Germany, really has people wondering if those hopes that were born 30 years ago are still, coming to reality in terms of a stable, healthy, functioning democracy where human rights are respected.
You mentioned the leaders of certain countries where populism is on the rise, and I'm just wondering how people there in Germany feel about their presence today.
It's not the actual prime ministers, the people making decisions. It's the heads of state. So I don't think there's, much reaction to be expected. If, for instance, Viktor Orban, who is the prime minister of Hungary, were here, it might be, another kettle of fish. I don't know if there'd be demonstrations. It's purely speculative. And perhaps that is exactly why they haven't been invited. There's a protocol level presence of these countries, and the Germans intended to, if you will, sort of tip their hats to the other countries which took part in the sweeping changes in Eastern Europe, beginning, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and then spreading to Hungary, and then here. So that's the reason why those countries are represented. And, I can't really answer as to why the actual decision makers aren't here, but I think it would have been possibly problematic. And it's a fair guess that that's the reason why.
And Nick, this is probably going to be Chancellor Angela Merkel's last big event, commemorating the wall coming down. And I'm assuming that as a former citizen of East Germany, this is all very poignant for her personally.
I think you're right, and she's been uncharacteristically open about her feelings. She's a leader who's been in power for 14 years now and has succeeded by keeping her cards quite close to her chest, and she's taken this occasion to speak to a couple of German newspapers to talk about what this 30th anniversary means to her. Some interesting things that she said were, one thing that really struck me, she said, at this time, had the wall not fallen, I would have been a 65-year-old. At 60, I would have had the right to travel. And I think after visiting Western Germany, my next stop would have been the United States, and I would have liked to see Bruce Springsteen in concert. That's what her life would have been. That's how she imagined her future as a scientist in the former East Germany. However, she became chancellor, and it was quite miraculous because she was, as she said, a quadruple minority. She was a woman. She was an Easterner. She was a Protestant. and became a leader of this country. There's not a lot of political representation of the East. One thing that she did say that was really interesting as far as the alternative for Germany goes is, at least the people in the former Eastern Germany have the right to vote for parties that I happen to disagree with. And as Chancellor, it's my job to make those people happier in this country so they don't make that choice.
All right, Nick Spicer, thank you very much. Let's go to Berlin just to have a look at what is happening there now as we see a wreath is due to be laid right at the foot of what was the Berlin Wall. This as we watch commemorations marking the 30th anniversary of the wall crumbling on this day in 1989. We expect a number of dignitaries to lay flowers at the foot of what's left of it, what traces are left of that wall. And we can see the German President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, one of the people there, laying flowers at the foot of the wall on this grey November morning, marking the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, a wall which stood for 28 years, dividing the communist East from the capitalist West, effectively chopping the city in two. That wall started coming down on this day 30 years ago. That is the scene. Let's listen in. Okay, we've been looking at scenes there at what's left of sections of the Berlin Wall where dignitaries have been laying flowers on this 30th anniversary of the fall of that wall. Well, to discuss these commemorations with us in the studio, I'm joined by Georg Blumer, who is the Paris correspondent for Die Zeit newspaper. Thank you for coming to see us. Also to my left is Bernard de Montferrand, the former French ambassador to Germany. Thank you to you.
Morning.
And last but not least, our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert.
Morning.
Good morning. Now, let's start with you, Georg, because you are from Germany and you presumably grew up with a perception of what life was like either side of the wall. How does it make you feel looking at these events today? What sort of images does this all sort of conjure up in your mind?
Well, we were really, I lived in Hanover in Western Germany during my youth, and, the Iron Curtain was there 100 kilometers away. Every November we had tanks from the British and American armies, not the French, they were down south, doing huge maneuvers. We were in a constant... in a feeling of a constant sweat from, military sweat from both sides. And this really was a dream, who had come true, the unification. We couldn't, a few weeks before it happened, we couldn't imagine what was going on there. I mean, of course, there were signs for those who were politically, well informed, that you could, but that it really would, the Hungary, Poland, things, but that the wall would come down. We couldn't believe that on the same day. Gorbachev, of course he was nice, but wouldn't he send his, soldiers when it really counted? No, he didn't. That was such a surprise at that moment, that this whole nuclear sweat to humanity, and what all it was, we were, my generation were the ones demonstrating for peace against nuclear weapons, because just we felt so threatened from both sides, and that this could happen, peacefully, and with all these. West Berlin at that time was basically, left-wing city with all the conscientious objectors living there in communities, strange city, and by all the ways, but very lively. That city would, just live through these events with East Berlin, which was so, dark and somber, and where nothing went on, and I don't know.
I think you were as much surprised by what happened in November '89 as perhaps the rest of the world.
Exactly,
I mean, a huge sense of surprise. Ambassador de Montferrand, you were serving in Germany more recently than those events, but nevertheless you witnessed quite a lot of extraordinary events in East Berlin prior to the fall of the wall. Tell us a bit more.
Well, I'm struck today by the fact that compared with a few years ago, we feel that this anniversary comes with sort of deception. It's not as full of hope as it was. Why? Because I think it's back to reality. 30 years after, we realize that we lived at that moment a certain period, an ideal period in international relations. There was discussions. We managed to organize this transition peacefully, which really was a miracle. And today we see again that the world is a world of strong interest, of confrontations, of difficulties. It's a bit the same in Germany, where after the reunification, the fall of the wall, an enormous amount of effort, of financial transfer were made towards former East Germany. And I think it's unbelievable to see how the perception is different today. Because why has Germany been in difficulties in the early 2000s? Because of the enormous efforts made by the transfers. And the result is extremely positive, because at that time the difference of income per capita, per capita in former Eastern Germany was 40% of the level of West Germany. Today it's 75% or something like that. So the facts are there, but the perception is different. And for me the question is, why is this perception so different? Why should we as Europeans, as friends of Germany, to transform this this perception? Because this perception is linked with the difficulty that we see in all our middle classes in Europe and in Western and Eastern Europe, with this international crisis of middle class, which is problems of identity, with this problem of perception of what they are, how they feel in the world. And the second aspect is, in international relations, we discover very, very strongly that the world is very dangerous, and that the ideal hopes that we had 30 years ago, we have to face the reality. Yep. And that's what makes this celebration so different from the one we've known in the
more subdued than in previous years. That seems to be a recurrent theme that we're hearing on the ground, and previous guests we've spoken to have said exactly this, that it is a more subdued atmosphere this year for a number of reasons, which I think we'll go into a little bit more in more detail as the coverage goes on. Let me turn to you, Doug Herbert from our International Affairs desk. You were living in the former Soviet Union for a good portion of the 1980s. And again, rather like we've been hearing, you must have been extremely surprised by what happened in November 89.
It was shocking in a sense, because, we all sit here today and we have this expression in English, hindsight is 20/20. And you look at this anniversary and there's a sense in historical hindsight, it was sort of inevitable. The system was already overburdened. There had been stirrings of unrest. It was ready to collapse. But I remember I was a student in the first half of 1989 in the Soviet Union. And what was amazing at the time, first of all, I had no idea that this was coming. And in that first half of 1989, before sort of the summer revolutions, really starting in June, that string of countries having a lot of uprisings and unrest and all that, it wasn't clear. When I was, at least from, say, January to May or June of 1989, there was, in the Soviet Union, you had perestroika, glasnost underway. I marched in the final May Day parade, the Communist parade, the Red Square. Gorbachev was still very much up there on his mausoleum, waving to everyone. There wasn't a sense of imminent collapse. Maybe there was a sense of change. And what's interesting about this is that they were having a real springtime in Moscow, literal springtime. In opening, they were having new elections to something called the Congress of People's Deputies. It was a newfangled type of parliament, and there was a young politician, an upstart politician, who was very much Gorbachev's nemesis. His name was Boris Yeltsin. He was running as a candidate for the Russian Congress of People's Deputies at the time. There was a real sense of ferment there was a real sense of change. And I remember when I left Moscow in May 1989, I didn't go straight back to the United States. I went to the Czech Republic, back then Czechoslovakia, and I was there on January 4th. That was one of my first days there. Two amazing things happened on that day. I was walking down the street. I heard about Tiananmen, about the which we just heard our reporter in Berlin talk about. But also on June 4th, there were elections in Poland, and this was one of the big triggers. There were elections on June 4th in Poland, the first sort of semi-free elections in which the Solidarity Party won every single seat in the parliament, and I think something like 98, 99% of the seats in the Senate. Unheard of. And later, Poland would elect the first non-communist leader. So it was a real sense of ferment, but like I said, no inevitability. It wasn't until months later, 5 months after I left the Czech Republic, got back to the U.S., where I was still at university, seeing the events then from afar, I was struck by, I can't believe this is happening. And I was also struck by George H.W. Bush. He was 1 year into his one term as president back then. He gave a press conference 2 days after the fall of the wall, 11th of November, 1989. And he was asked, Mr. President, you don't seem too elated by these movements. He was sort of sitting there in this very sort of casual posture in the briefing room of the Oval Office. And he was like, well, I'm just not a very, perhaps, elated type of character. I'm a very subdued type of person. But these are very big events. But I remember him saying at the time, he says, I don't think, any single event, even such as this, the fall of the Berlin Wall, you could say really is the end of the Iron Curtain, so to speak. So there was a sense of watching George H.W. Bush, and today you could debate this, I guess, ad nauseum. Did he miss history? Did he not really understand the magnitude of what was happening, or did he actually get it? It was just his character, his temperament. Because later on, I tend towards the former. He got it. He was just a very subdued person in his reaction. He was the one who subsequently in his talks with Helmut Kohl and also Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister at the time, they were the ones who sort of paved the way towards reunification 2 years later.
Just thanks for that, Doug. Let's just go back to Berlin for just a moment. We can see there the Chancellor Angela Merkel, and we're expecting her to deliver a key speech in the next couple of minutes, and we'll certainly be covering the content of that speech from start to finish. It's really the main speech of the day. We're also expecting to hear from the German president. So two key speeches that we'll be covering for you. We expect Chancellor Merkel to get started fairly shortly. Let me turn to you again, Jorgen, because, Chancellor Merkel grew up in East Germany. So as we were saying to our correspondent, this is a very poignant day for her personally. I mean, for you growing up in West Germany, what did you imagine life was like in the East? I mean, just how gloomy and miserable did you think it was? Or perhaps did you have a different view altogether?
Well, they were always trying to look at our television in the West. They were all trying to get our books and newspapers at that time. We had good friends of our family in the East, and they would always, they were once in a while permitted to visit us, or we could go there, and, it was all, it wasn't a poor country exactly. They had their standards of living, and they had, our coffee was better, but they had some cookies which were better than ours, and so.
Did you get to try these things? I mean, was there any
yes,
sort of
exchange? Yes, of course. I always waited for Christmas. I always waited for a parcel from the East with some special cake tree. Baumkuchen, how would you translate that? It's a very famous cake from Germany, which is, I found it again in Tokyo later in very fancy bakeries, and so they had their special thing. But of course, they didn't really, we didn't share much of our day. We met on occasions when festive atmosphere. We didn't know really about their daily life, how harsh it was in their enterprises, in their schools, and how really the indoctrination worked of the system. I mean, usually when you met our family friends, they were, they weren't communists. They tried to hide all that. But
you could tell just from looking at people, couldn't you, to a certain extent, who was from the East and who was from the West, not least by how people dressed.
Of course, there was you could tell it by the dress, and then later people sent clothes also, and sometimes you couldn't. You could tell once you passed the border. It was such a somber and country in a way, where you had unjoyful in some way, and it's hard to say, but then as a Westerner, you don't want it to, look down on them. You want, there were also aspects of their life, which, like the kindergartens, worked much better in the East than in the West, which we never had.
Great social security.
That's one of the great, works of Merkel as a chancellor, that we have kindergarten for everybody now, and that's her East German program in a way that she put through, and so. And there was also, in every Western family at that time, we discussed, are these communists in the East, really devils, or are they, not much worse than us? Because it's also one consequence of our terrible German history of Hitler and everything, that we had that communist system. It's not just the Soviet Union which invaded us, it's ourselves which created these two states in a way through our rotten history. And so there was always, I would say, in every German family, a discussion, how bad was it really in the East?
And Ambassador, you had a chance to visit East Germany, I understand, when it was still the GDR. I mean, what were your impressions of visiting a country that today no longer exists?
I was posted in the French military government in Berlin from 79 to 81. And of course, we were, all the West, if I may say so, was looking at the East German society. See, what is really happening? What is the level of the control of the population and so on? I think what we could look at the TV, of course, of East Germany. What we underestimated, I think, at that time was that the small openings which were made, of course, the family visits, which were very important, which created a new atmosphere. Second, the fact that more and more of the East Germans could listen at radio and TV and look at the TV of West Germany. Even we in West Berlin, we had a TV transmitter that was sending French TV in part of Eastern Germany. It was totally forbidden, but we did it. And I think it was impossible to know. You know that the tiger is a paper tiger when you touch the tiger. And at that time, everybody had the feeling that the East German society had a great fragility, but in the same time, the system was still extremely strong, and the security system, as you know, we've seen that in very famous films, was so terrible. And but there was a sort of question mark on what was really the East Germany, what was the level of of unsatisfaction of the people, and of course there was no answer at that time because the regime was still very strong.
Well, there was. I mean, just to suggest one answer was shown in the reason that the wall was built in the first place. I mean, the East German government called it the anti-fascist bulwark. That was their official thing, right? It was supposed to be to protect East Germans against the fascist threat from the outside. But it was the biggest open secret in the world. The real reason it was built was to stem the exodus, and that's what it had become, of over 2 million East Germans to the West in the years. Because, it's easy to forget that there were many years when East Germans, before the wall was built in August 61, were able to just freely come and go. That you could go and shop, you could go and work if you lived in the eastern sector of the city under the Soviet control. You could go to the other sector freely. They came back at the end of the day, back and forth. But the exodus was such, they lost so many also highly qualified people. It was a drain and a drain and a drain, and it was obviously extremely embarrassing, highly embarrassing to the East German government. They weren't going to admit that was the reason they built the wall, but it was clearly the reason. And even in the weeks leading up to the building of that wall overnight on August 12th to 13th, you still had thousands of people. Some of the biggest flows away from the east to the west were in those final days and weeks before the wall was built.
Okay, so more about keeping people in than keeping any
all about
threat
keeping people
out.
in. Yeah.
We're just looking at the scene there. Angela Merkel mixing with the crowds as these commemorations are underway in Berlin. We're expecting her to deliver an address very shortly, followed by the German president. We've been talking about perspective on those events in 1989 around this table, and we also heard a bit about Soviet perspective. But let's find out now what people in modern-day Russia think about today's commemorations there in Berlin. Here's France 24's Nick Holdsworth in Moscow.
The Russian view of these historic commemorative events in Berlin today is a little bit sour. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said that, of course, Russia had always welcomed the vision of a united, peaceful, prosperous Europe without dividing lines, but they were still waiting to see that materialise in Europe 30 years after the fall of the wall. It had always been a Russian policy, and always would be, but they were still waiting, she said. Now that view perhaps seems a bit negative, but it's not only in Russia. In Germany, they issued invitations to the Russians to attend, and there certainly is a Russian in attendance at the commemorations today, but it's not Vladimir Putin. The view across Russia also reflects a general lack of interest and indeed knowledge about these historic events. A couple of polls found that as many as 1 in 4 Russian youngsters aged between 18 and 24 had never even heard of the fall of the wall, and up to a fifth of 24 to 39-year-olds were similarly ignorant. Across the population, the figure's a bit better. 88% are aware of the fall of the wall, although a lot fewer know why it was built and exactly when. Generally speaking, people are fairly positive about the fall of the Berlin Wall, with 43% of Russians saying they see it as a positive event, although that figure does drop to only 30% of those 18 to 24-year-olds. And perhaps, after all, the view from the Kremlin is not so surprising after all, when one considers that it was only just over 2 years after the fall of the wall, in December 1991, that the Soviet Union itself disappeared from the map.
And that was France 24's Nick Holdsworth there, with a Russian perspective on those events taking place today in Berlin, commemorating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is the scene at the Chapel of Reconciliation, right next to where the wall once stood and divided Berlin in two. There will be some prayers held there, and they were expecting from that chapel the German Chancellor Angela Merkel to deliver a speech. There she is, sitting in that chapel. Let me just turn to our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert. Doug, we were just hearing there about Russian perspective on these developments. Clearly, no cause for celebration amongst people in Russia this year, or indeed any other anniversary year of the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, certainly no real cause for celebration for Vladimir Putin. I mean, he himself said in a now sort of infamous or famous, depending on how you look at it, remarks back in 2005 that he believes that the collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously that was 2 years after the events we're talking about today, but the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So it's interesting when you see where Russia stands today, because you have sort of an authoritarian regime in a sense, in many respects, even though we are seeing the beginnings of sort of more civic movements and grassroots movements isolated throughout Russia, in various cities. We recently saw protests in Yekaterinburg over the building controversial church they were going to build in a cherished park, and citizen power, they actually rose up and they prevented that from happening. So there is a sense that you've had sort of more liberal sprouts of democratic freedoms isolated in pockets of Russia, and that's still sort of looming on the horizon ahead. But the general trend has been that the official government trend is that the events of the revolutions of 1989, they're not looked at in a very fond light by the leadership there. And this goes in line with what we've seen with Vladimir Putin, who's never really looked fondly on the color revolutions, as he called them, later on, whether we're talking about in Georgia or Ukraine or so on and so forth. He always saw them as sort of maybe fostered by the West, conspiracies by Western powers and agents against Russia to bring down, to humiliate Great Mother Russia. So the agenda right now in Russia today, although the government would say that it's democratic, that it has democratic intentions, it's a little darker than that. And I think that the legacy, that's why the way we're celebrating this event today, the way a lot of people in the West would celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall, it's seen through a very different prism than in Russia.
But you mentioned a conspiracy theories there in Russia that exist, that the West was trying to bring about the fall of the Soviet Union and had an active hand in it. I mean, to a certain extent, those theories were justified, weren't they, when you consider that there were, as you were saying, Ambassador, efforts by the French to broadcast French media into East Germany. That's just a small token, but aimed at getting a message across. The British Prime Minister of the day, Margaret Thatcher, made no secret of her efforts to appease and get close to all opposition movements that were popping up in Poland, in the then Czechoslovakia. The Pope of the age, John Paul II, came from Poland and was a very staunch anti-communist campaigner in many ways. So do you think that those fears that there were conspiracies to bring about the collapse of communism were actually quite justified?
I think the main reason because all this happened is a failure of USSR. I mean, a total economic failure. The system was falling down, full of debts, and East Germany was an example. East Germany couldn't pay back to West Germany, had been indebted towards West Germany, couldn't pay back more than $30 billion at that time. There was also a transformation with the glasnost and the perestroika, and in all Eastern countries, progressively, they understood that the Russians wouldn't shoot if there was a revolt. And there were elections, and then the understanding that the doors were open. And of course, the words of the West had a certain role. The word of the Pope, even in the past, the word of de Gaulle about the stupidity of this rupture between East and West. And all those words progressively made their progression in the public opinions. But I think the main reason was the collapse of the system.
Indeed. Let's just take our viewers back to Berlin. That is the scene there in the Chapel of Reconciliation. Prayers are being led by the Archbishop of Berlin, and we're expecting the German Chancellor to come up to the front any minute now and to give an address. It's an address we've been waiting for, which we will take in English for you. That is the scene in a border area right where the wall once stood. Chapel of Reconciliation, and you can hear various prayers and various memories are being shared there, all waiting for the Chancellor.
Viele von uns genießen heute eine Freiheit, von der Generationen zuvor nur träumen konnten.
Let's move on to sort of looking about what happened after those events in November 1989 and start looking forwards to sort of the process of reconciliation. I haven't talked to you for a moment, Georg. Let me ask you what your opinions are about how that whole process of the reunification of Germany was handled, because it all happened in a very short space of time. Within less than a year of the wall coming down, Germany was suddenly reunited.
Well, then when these actual events went over, very much Chancellor Kohl became the center of action, for the Germans, who really pushed that unification to happen in a way that, West Germany would take over East Germany. And there's still a lot of discussion, I think, between citizens in East and West, if they unite, was that the way to do it? Wouldn't we, shouldn't we have gone more slowly, accept more of what was the culture of the East and, be more respectful to that culture? I think most political observers agree that Kohl did it well and that was the way to do it, maybe also economically, so they wouldn't keep on with their own money and we would never have gotten the euro had they, trained there or taken too much time. But on a human level, you feel it today with, it takes time to get to know each other, to make friends, to really accept where the other thinks different or where their tastes are different, and that is still going on today. It's not that you sense who has some roots in the East, and Easterners think who has, we don't have the natural sensibility to understand the other. It's the work of generations. And
were there vocal critics at the time in
yes,
East
of
Germany
course. I mean, there were
madness.
We had the political situation. East Germany was that Chancellor Kohl was weak. He would lose the next elections against a coalition between the Social Democrats and the Greens, which 10 years later, came to power. But at that time, we had Oscar Lafontaine as a very strong leader of the Social Democrats who was against this quick reunification, who wanted East Germany to be its own, different, and who completely then lost on this line, and there was an attack against him. It was high noon in German politics at that time, and what came through is that the eastern side, in elections voted for the conservative parties, more for the Christian Democrats than for the left. So that allowed Kohl to go through with his fast-track program in a way. But of course, when you remember these images of the East German leaders together with Kohl, where they almost were humiliated and they couldn't, raise their voice anymore, and I don't know what was his name, Mazière,
De
Maizière. I mean, you felt they were humiliated all the time, and that would, come through later. That wouldn't just go away after a few months and then we were all friends. No, and that what you see it how turnout of elections is different in East still, and how Merkel now, whom we see now, she has become such a criticized figure by East Germans. She's more, if you look at her, at when she shows up in little cities in East Germany, how much she's been criticized and yelled at, and it's.
Surprising.
It just shows us, you may like Merkel or not as a West German, but you wouldn't shout against. She's just not that person. You respect her and for what she is, and she's certainly not one to be hated or loved. Neither, sure. And in East Germany, that's completely different, obviously. And
a very different perception of Merkel today to, let's say, 10 years ago when she presided over the 20th anniversary. We'll come back to you in just a moment. I'd also like to pick up on the idea of that was German criticism and observation of the reunification. I'd like to get international perspective because it was by no means a popular decision universally across Europe. There was resistance here in Europe to the idea of a reunited Germany. Let's cross to Berlin and speak to our correspondent there, Nick Spicer. Nick, we're watching events in the Chapel of Reconciliation there. Angela Merkel due to speak any minute. What's the significance of where they are right now?
Well, I mean, I'm standing near them, and I'm standing on the former death strip. This is a place where people, you see tourists behind me, come to remember. And the pictures we've been looking at of young people speaking in the Chapel of Remembrance, I think are part of the ceremony whereby, well, the torch is just being passed along to the next generation, torch of remembrance, and the hope that people who are young now will understand what this all meant. The fall of the wall, the lack of freedom across large parts of Europe, and the struggle to achieve it. And we're waiting for Angela Merkel to speak. I see see another young person down on my monitor. There's an interesting comment from a young Frenchman from Strasbourg who said, we've come here to commemorate the fall of the wall as new walls of shame, he called it, are being built, where citizens in Western Europe are turning against each other. So all that is part of the ceremony that is really taking place here. And we're waiting, of course, for Angela Merkel to come and say something, give her thoughts on this occasion. She walked through a crowd of about 500 people, tourists, people from across the world taking selfies. It was quite friendly, shaking hands. And we'll just basically, I guess, go back to her when she has something to say.
This will, of course, more likely than not be, well, almost certainly be the last anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that Angela Merkel presides over as Chancellor. And it's always particularly poignant to her, as we were saying earlier, given the fact she came from the East herself.
You're right, and what your guest was saying earlier, I think, I'm not in her head, it probably hurts her to a certain extent that, she's not as popular in the East as she is in the West. She remains an incredibly popular politician after 14 years in office, over 60% in most opinion polls, if memory serves. And she's still elected, in a local riding in East Germany up on the Baltic. But many people in East Germany who are voting for the alternative for Germany hold against her the opening of the doors, if
Nick,
you will,
I'm going to interrupt you. Sorry there. I'm going to cut you off. Angela Merkel is standing at the plinth there in the Chapel of Reconciliation. Let's listen in.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen aus den Parlamenten,
dear colleagues, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank all the young people who have spoken in this chapel. You know that in former times, this is where the Church of the Reconciliation was. Their words give us food for thought. We also heard from the young people of the Visegrad group. What appears in everything that has been said is that the young people are fully aware of their future. We must take this into account because the Church of Reconciliation was on the death strip after the reconstruction, and for all Berliners it was a symbol. It was destroyed in 1985, and it was a despicable act because if it was destroyed, it was for those who were on death row should be targeted, and it was people who were seeking freedom, and the destruction of this church shows how much the GDR regime refused reconciliation. It was a regime that refused to defend human rights. A very considerable number of people suffered under that dictatorship, and we will not forget them, and all those who died close to this wall because they were seeking freedom. I remember all those who were imprisoned and who suffered from repression because their family members had fled. I remember all those who were watched and who were handed over, and those who were oppressed and saw their dream shattered because they did not want to submit to arbitrariness. The 9th of November is a key date for German history. Today, our thoughts are with the victims of the pogroms of the 9th of November of 1938, and we recall the crimes committed on the night of the 9th to the 10th of November, Crystal Night, and we know what happened after that. It was the crime against humanity, the Holocaust, the end of civilization. The 9th of November is a very special day. Why? Because we've lived through extreme moments, but also happy moments in our history. Hatred, racism, anti-Semitism must be fought against, and we will do our utmost to defend freedom, democracy, and human dignity. And the 9th of November 1989, 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. Shortly before that event, no one would have thought it possible. Early in 1989, a decisive year for us all, a small minority rose up to defend democracy, civil rights, and was oppressed, persecuted, imprisoned. That minority managed to encourage thousands of people who gathered in October 1989 to demonstrate and protest in the streets. Others came from Hungary, from Poland. They all contributed to the fall of the wall and paved the way for the reunification of our country, and I thank them all. The peaceful revolution in the GDR inspired a great many people. There was Solidarność, the 77 Charter, and the human chains who fought for freedom, and the Iron Curtain in Hungary. This allowed us to revive democracy, and East and West Europe came together and came united. But our values, democracy, equality, rule of law, the defense of civil rights, cannot be taken for granted. They must be embodied, upheld, and defended. And in future, Europe must fight for democracy, freedom, tolerance, and human rights. This at a time of technological upheaval. It's even more important than before. Our individual contributions may seem modest, but that must not discourage us. On the contrary, we must remember the year of Václav Havel, when he said that freedom is important because every small gesture is perhaps not a lot, but altogether we are irresistible. The Berlin Wall is today part of history. We no longer have a wall that separates us. And no wall can be indestructible. Rainer Kunst, a poet, said about the wall that when we tore it down, we didn't realize how high it was. We had become used to its horizon, to its shadow, to its silence. And today we are here. We no longer have any excuse. That goes for people in the East and the West. We have absolutely no excuse to defend freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Okay, let's cross to our correspondent in Berlin, Nick Spicer. We've just been listening in there to the German Chancellor Angela Merkel giving that address at the Chapel of Remembrance, and she answered that question that I put to you earlier about what is the significance of that as a choice of venue for today's commemorations. That came across very clearly. For you, though, Nick, what were the other key messages you felt that the Chancellor was keen to get across in that address?
I think there was a very clear call to action. That was my big, takeaway when she said what was gained in 1989, the democracy, the rule of law, and civil rights cannot be taken for granted. And that especially in this time of technological upheaval, you may feel that your individual actions are meaningless, but in fact, and she was quoting Václav Havel, the former Czech dissident and national leader, they're more important than ever. And concluding her little speech by saying we no longer have any excuse to defend democracy and freedom now that the wall is gone, because before, of course, half of Germany was unable to do so. So she also talked about the various other movements, I think as a sign of welcome to her visiting guests from the 4 Central and Eastern European countries, talking about what happened in Czechoslovakia, the Charter 77 group, the Baltic countries which formed a human chain, and the Hungarians opening their border, which of course allowed the first East Germans to flow through into Austria. But above all, as I was saying, a call to action. Human rights and democracy cannot be taken for granted. Even though the wall is gone, people in Europe, people around the world need to fight for them more than ever.
Yeah, and Nick, interesting that she was preceded by a lot of young people who were speaking. We didn't listen into what they were saying, but they were obviously very young speakers before her, either reading passages or recollections of life behind the wall. I mean, that in itself is a message. She and those who organise today's commemorations clearly want the baton to be passed to the next generation so that the memory of the Berlin Wall and everything that it changed really lives on for generations to come.
I think you're right. The only enemy here is forgetfulness. It's the point of this whole ceremony. That was the point of Merkel's speech. That's the point of the memorial where I'm standing. I'm standing on the death strip. People you see walking behind me would have been shot 30 years ago for being here. And this is the point of the commemoration. You know, we've been saying earlier in our coverage there's an element of sort of a somber tone to some of this because of the events in Central and Eastern Europe, elsewhere in the world, the spread of populism and authoritarianism. But this is, I think, you know, seen by Angela Merkel as an opportunity to speak out for the values that she holds dear and thinks need to be defended more than ever.
Okay, thank you very much for that update, Nick Spicer there in Berlin. No doubt we'll be checking in with you in just a short while throughout the course of this morning and our continuing coverage of those events in Berlin, commemorating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let's return to our guests here in the studio. Doug, let me start with you and just talking about the sort of the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, it was, as we were saying earlier, an event, not the only event,
right,
but in a series of events that brought about the collapse, essentially, of a whole ideology and the disappearance from the map of an entire country.
Absolutely. A monumental event. It's amazing about the night itself because anyone who was around at the time remembers at least the either televised images, if they weren't there, of, at midnight, everyone surging towards the breaches in the wall. There were 3 checkpoints through which, through really an accident of history, East German official sort of accidentally announced and erroneously that the border was open. So you had a surge of people going through. And I think, a lot of the people who went through, what was interesting about it is over the years that the Berlin Wall was standing, right, the 28 years that it was standing, it's now actually been down longer than it was ever standing, right, down 30 years and standing 28, which is interesting. But the people who went through, most of the focus had been on, over the years, people trying to escape. You had thousands and thousands of East Germans who actually did succeed in escaping, and you also had some 140 or so who were killed trying to make that attempt, however they tried to do it. But I think a lot of the ones who went through that night, what was interesting and novel about the whole thing is they went through, they partied a little bit in West Berlin. They had some champagne. They saw the bright lights of the main avenue there, and then they went back into East Berlin, which was sort of unprecedented, an East Berlin resident, sort of crossing over and then going back, knowing that they would be able to, they didn't need to escape necessarily because they would be able to go back again. But I think for this, in the subsequent years, I do think that the legacy has been one of perhaps a lot of the immediate hopes not living up to what the idealization of what the West would be like, and and the image of the liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is now the very term itself is coming on hard times, and one of the irony, the dark legacies, is the fact that Poland and Hungary, which we were saying were sort of started this whole chain of events, earlier in 1989, and those unrest and uprisings, they were sort of the leading lights of this sort of revolution that led to the fall, the crumbling of the Berlin Wall. Today, they are, depending on, once again, the prism through which you're looking, but you can argue that they're some of the darker spots right now on the European continent and in the European project right now, led by very nationalist, you might even say xenophobic, ultra-nationalist, in some case, governments, whose leaders would say that, no, they're very democratic, they just have the people's interest at heart, but in fact they are antithetical to a lot of perhaps the values as they were at the time, or at least seen as a time, at the governments at the time. If you look at the government government of Poland today versus Lech Walesa, back the head of the Solidarity movement back in Poland. Very, very different nature, very, very different tones. And I think it's ironic that just before the wall came down, I think less than 24 hours, you had Helmut Kohl. He was actually on a trip to Poland. He was meeting with Lech Walesa, and he reassured Lech Walesa at the time. He said he thought it would be many, many years before Germany was reunited. 24 hours later, we know what happened.
Yeah, so it took the whole world, including those who ought to have been in the know, absolutely by surprise. Ambassador de Montferrand, just picking up on something we were talking about a little bit earlier, about how today's event seems a little bit more subdued than the 2009 edition. And Doug has touched on a few of the issues there for the various dark spots on the map, perhaps the lack of the less hope that exists, let's say, in continental Europe for the whole project of Europe, and perhaps an altogether more subdued mood. Do you agree with the reasons for that sort of more subdued mood there in Berlin today?
Probably. I think few people insist on the fact that it is Angela Merkel we're speaking today. Angela Merkel comes from the East. Second, I think what is important is that all Eastern Europe and East Germany in 1989-90 felt that they were recovering their sovereignty. They had been deprived from sovereignty for decades. Suddenly they could benefit from their sovereignty. And in former East Germany, they were integrated into a country where they, of course, had their democratic sovereignty, but it was very different. And in all Eastern Europe, they became very quickly member of the European Union, and we gave them the wrong impression that we were taking part of their sovereignty. And I think that explains today so many disillusions in this field. And coming back to Angela Merkel, I remember Angela Merkel speaking to President Sarkozy. That was exactly 10 years ago. And she told him, you are always in a hurry. And, President Sarkozy was always in a hurry. You have to understand that I come from a very different background. I have learned the slowness of hope. I knew that only when I would be 65, I would be free to cross the border and do whatever because I wouldn't cost anything anymore to East Germany. And this is this approach with the sort of more long-term way of thinking, which I think we have not taken into account enough, either at the level of Germany. It's not enough to spend money on a certain area, geographical area, to change the things. In Europe, it's not enough to go very fast, to spend money also to help, even if we have helped a lot the countries from Eastern Europe. We have spent an enormous amount of money to increase our level of life. Politics is different. It's a perception, and today we have a lot to do to change the perception of the public opinion of those countries, to enable them to understand that they have their destiny in their hands and it's not in Brussels. Although it is true, because they decide in Hungary, in Poland and so, but we have not found the good words to give them an answer to this question of identity. And this is our problem today, to find this message. And I remember also Wolfgang Schäuble a few months ago when there was those events in Halle in Eastern Germany, and there were there were violences and so, and he said, of course, we can say that those people are bad, that we condemn them, but have we found the good word and the good political message to give them an answer to their anxieties and to their difficulties? And we have today, and we see this is the unease of our political systems in Europe. we have a real difficulty in getting back the opinion in the mainstream. And this is a question of a political message, of political dialogue, whether with yellow jackets, whether with many other movements, how to reconcile part of our population with the mainstream and with the values of democracy.
I can see you're wanting to jump in there.
Yes,
what do you want to say?
Definitely too much praise for our Chancellor, because I just was really disappointed by her speech, and it really shook me. Your correspondent, Nick, was right. She was talking about her values, and Europe was lacking in the whole discourse. He did a speech without really that feeling that the whole reunification wouldn't have been possible with Germany integrated into Europe. Also with the French, with the English, being a good partner to everybody in Europe. No German reunification without the Europeans liking the Germans, not just the Polish revolting or the Hungarian revolting, and we needed everybody in Europe for that unification. And that is what is so terribly lacking in all her leadership, with Merkel, even with Sarkozy at that time, that you have a feeling she doesn't get what Europe really means in all this historic. She gets what freedom means, what democracy means. That's what she's really been fighting for. She is close to Havel and all these dissidents in the East. Great, I support what she's saying, and that she gives credit to Poland. It wasn't the first, like you said, the leaders were in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia for that upheaval. But if you talk as a chancellor to the world here, what she did, you have to put that in a European context, which includes France, which includes British, and of course the American friends at that time. And she didn't. And that makes her so terribly just German, Yeah,
and in fact, one of the things that has been criticized, about Merkel's government, not her personally, but her foreign minister, almost sort of attempting to airbrush America's contribution out of the history books, in a way, in a speech she gave last week, when he seemed to suggest that the reunification of Germany was Europe's gift to itself. I mean, he omitted the key player, a key player, America.
Sure. Look, I mean, as we were saying earlier, at the very time, there happened to be a U.S. president in power who was sort of more reacting to events than actually initiating them or even helping to foster them and nurture them a little bit, George H.W. Bush. But you did have, you can't discount the U.S. role, at least the rhetorical role, first going all the way back, right, to John F. Kennedy when he stood before the wall and he, the famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which actually, what doesn't it mean? I'm a jelly donut or something? But and then later on, obviously, in 1987, an almost now equally famous speech with Ronald Reagan standing behind a then sealed Brandenburg Gate, saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And that was 2 years before the wall came down. And Gorbachev, as we were saying, his refusal to shoot or to intervene on the behalf of these Eastern European communist leaders is really what helped to accelerate the events and hasten the demise of the wall. But look, the U.S., it contributed. I don't think it was extremely activist. I think, going back to what we were saying earlier, I said a lot of it was a self-implosion. I think that there was a sense that the system had reached its date of expiration, in a sense, and it just sort of caved in on itself. It was no longer viable.
Sorry, Ambassador, you wanted to say something?
No, just one point about the style of Mrs. Merkel. What the speech she did is exactly in her style. No big emotions, no big historical speech, no big ideas. I stick to what I can do, and it has always been somewhat disappointing for some people around, saying who expected in the last 10 years from Merkel sometimes more historical perspective, more ambition, more explanations of the role she wanted to give Germany in the new Europe, in the new world, and so. But this is a style, and I've always seen her, even when her speechwriters were writing speeches with some sentiment or so, she managed to keep those speeches on a low key aspect, and this is probably because a little bit of their past, I think.
Thomas,
But it's sometimes disappointing, I would say.
No, but that's also something you'd say we all like about her, that
she's level-headed.
Less dramatic than others. But that doesn't justify to just leave away Europe. Or that doesn't justify for Germany to want to throw out Greece of the European Union at one time. There was always this lack of European commitment in her deeds. I don't care about her words. If it were just the words, okay, but it follows her deeds, and that's why she never responded to Macron in the last 2 years. Also, it seemed like so. There is something, and where you finally think it comes deep from herself. Of course, as an East German, you might not have that attachment to the European unification project. As somebody else,
But that may explain why there is a sort of growing anti-German sentiment in pockets of Italy, in pockets of Greece, as you said.
Of course.
And it's perhaps directed at her more than, the rest of Germany.
And it's of course that what the ambassadors just said. At least she also didn't have something to say to these, lower classes all over Europe. She doesn't have a message for them.
I think we've seen this divide even starkly in the past week between the Franco-German axis, where Emmanuel Macron is sort of right now almost the opposite when it comes to his approach to Europe. I was trying to picture if Emmanuel Macron had been making this speech today, he probably would have taken about an hour or an hour and a half. We would still be listening to it.
She was pretty efficient. It was
she was very efficient. No. She was extremely efficient. She was succinct. But what I'm saying is, if this had been an Emmanuel Macron making the speech, it would have been framed as which he actually did in the past week, gave a big interview in which he sort of called, raised a red flag over Europe being at a critical juncture right now and the need to really step up and defend Europe very, very strongly. He was very blunt about it. But I think he would have framed this as much more in the context of the here and now and the critical moment in history period. And if we've learned anything from the Berlin Wall, it's now Europe as a whole has to come together. And right now, this isn't just Germany's historical event. This is Europe's historical event. Actually, you could go even further. You could say it's humanity's historical event. But I think Emmanuel Macron would probably limit himself to talking about Europe today.
Well, there is, I think, something. What is also missing in that speech, what comes maybe more from East Germany, that is a lack of thankfulness. It is, I think, especially in the West, the reunification of Germany was nothing we did. Of course, the Easterners had much more into it. They went demonstrating and they had some courage to go on the streets. We did nothing to it. So we are really thankful for the French, for the Americans, and, above all, Gorbachev and the Russians to have made this possible. And this thankfulness is important. It's one of our great capacities to be thankful to other nations for our own existence and our own state. And that is something a chancellor has to project, and which gives Germany all its power it has today, because we are only powerful when we're European and when we are acting in a concert. And so far we seem to be a pretty rational player in all this and liked player by others,
Okay, so there was some of the elements you feel were absent in the Chancellor's speech today in the Chapel of Reconciliation. And as we've been saying, there were huge divides before the wall came down. Those divides started to diminish in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which of course ushered in the end of communism and brought about German reunification. But 30 years on, economic divisions do remain. And in eastern regions of Germany, the average income is about 500 euros lower than it is in the West. That's today. Well, a France 24 team went to find out more about that.
The German town of Peitz is just 150 kilometers southeast of the capital, but it might as well be a world away. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the city center has been rebuilt, but the mayor says the transition from east to west has been bittersweet.
All of the economic infrastructure of the region crumbled at the time. Since then, the city has completely transformed.
Before 1989, Brandenburg's population lived from textiles, chemistry, and paper. Only the coal industry has survived. But the last major source of jobs is living on borrowed time. As Germany plans to phase out fossil fuels, Jörg Krakow is preparing for the worst.
We hope to avoid a new shift because the memory of what we experienced in the 1990s is still painful, and nothing was done at the time to replace all these jobs.
Millions of euros invested in infrastructure, but no plan for an economic transition. As a result, the town lost nearly a third of its residents since 1989. At the street market, some of the oldest residents are seeing their disillusionment with reunification transformed into fear for their future.
In terms of jobs, it was never the same again. That also goes for pensions. We have a lot to catch up on compared to restaurant regions.
We will lose even more jobs when the coal-fired plants close. Nothing good will come of this, and we are the ones who are going to suffer. Purchasing power will drop again.
Their fears and frustrations are fueling the rise of the far right. In September's local elections, 37% of Peitz's residents voted for the nationalist Alternative for Germany. Turns out the anti-immigration party is the only one fighting for the coal industry.
We need to take care of this region now, otherwise we're heading for catastrophe. We've always said we want a quiet revolution to finally achieve what people were protesting for in 1989. For now, it's not the case.
Targeting the failures of reunification. An efficient strategy in a region where 59% of residents say they feel like second-class citizens.
Okay, there we see some socio-economic divisions that 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall exist to this day. Well, let's cross back to France 24's Nick Spicer, who's standing by for us in Berlin. Nick, it looks as though that service at the Chapel of Remembrance, just a short distance from where you are, is coming to an end. I can see Angela Merkel, she appears to be heading towards the exit. I mean, on balance, what does today's series of commemorations mean to the average German person, do you think?
I mean, that's a really important question. I think, there's probably going to be 80 million plus different emotions, sets of emotions. It's the population of Germany. Definitely an east-west split. Overall, a feeling of gratefulness that it occurred. Certainly in the east, some questions about why it took so long to catch up, and will they ever catch up? For instance, as we were just hearing, sort of, the economic disparities, the income gap. There are 80 universities in Germany, and all of the rectors are from West Germany, for instance. About 2% of the boards of German companies are made up of people from East Germany. So those are questions I think people might be asking. And it's very, very regional. In certain parts of East Germany, we're hearing about the coal industry was devastated. People may be feeling hard done by, and they look at the refugees who came in, who were given German lessons and job training. A quarter of those refugees now have jobs, and they feel like, well, we would have liked to be welcomed that way back into the new country. So a whole bunch of different, I think, emotions, a recognition, I think, for people who are not members of the Alternative for Germany, that it really represents a kind of return to the past, some of the dark ideas of the 1930s, a rejection of human rights, a rejection of the other, a rejection of tolerance. So it's a day for thinking about the past and thinking about the present and imagining what kind of future Germans want and how to go about achieving it.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, what I'm really taking away from what you're saying and what I've been hearing as well here in the studio is that 30 years on from the fall of the Berlin Wall, the healing process actually isn't over by any means. And there are fractures, there are these inequalities, and it may be those fractures that have been exploited by people who have now, they've been useful fractures to bring about the rise of, as you say, the AfD. And just last week there were reports of what was called a Nazi emergency in the city of Dresden. I mean, clearly Germany is in a moment of deep reflection, and today will be a very big part of that, I'd have thought.
It is, and it's really interesting to look at the uses of history now in contemporary politics, because the Alternative for Germany is, to use your word, and many people here would use it as well, exploiting the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, because in Germany it's called the Turn, the Wende, and AfD is promising its voters the Wende 2.0. We're going to complete the turn. It wasn't completed. The wall fell, and the reunification and the turn towards democracy was not completed, but we'll complete it for you once you vote for us into office, and we'll get rid of the refugees and so on, and a whole bunch of things. So history is being used and exploited, I think it's safe to say, by the Alternative for Germany, to the outrage of many of the dissidents who risked prison or went to prison in order to bring about the end of East Germany. They have very strong words for the, it must be pointed out, leaders of the Alternative for Germany who largely come from West Germany, or the former West Germany, coming to the eastern regions to use these old feelings and these ideas in order to gain political office. And some people have compared that to the way the Western German government privatized large parts of the East German economy, a kind of corporate takeover, corporate raid. This is a kind of a political corporate raid from Western politicians on the far right of the resentments of East German voters.
Okay, sounds like there is an element of unfinished business to all of this. Thank you very much indeed for that, Nick Spicer. Nick, standing by for us there in Berlin. Just coming back to the studio, I mean, you are from Germany. You grew up in Germany. Does all of that ring true to you, the sense that just thinking about today's events and recent events, you know, like this Nazi emergency in Dresden, I mean, does it all sound to you like there's still some unfinished business here?
Well, that's exactly the question. Is this unfinished business in fact goes back to 45. You know, I have no doubt that, you know, these economic differences between East and West, what we've seen from that village before, you know, we will overcome that. The question is if the economic crisis in the East and also in the West, you know, where we have also some kind of a population underprivileged, like the Yellow West and so forth, are they, you know, heading for some kind of nationalism? You know, when I went to school, you know, we hadn't seen Holocaust yet. You know, there was a kind of attitude among the older generation. You know, it wasn't all that bad under Hitler. You know, that you were still able to say that when I was 15 or 10. You know, it changed when we saw Holocaust with the American TV series, and when we saw Shoah, the Claude Lanzmann film, when really it became unacceptable to say anything in Germany, you know, which could be understood as positive towards apologetic, you know. It only happened in the 80s. It was still different in the 70s and 60s. In the 50s, of course, nobody talked about, you know. So there is, of course, a big concern that there has always been some, you know, silent part of the population who wasn't allowed to talk during the last decades, in a way, you know, and who would maybe not go to vote, you know. And then now we're hearing that people who have never voted are voting for the AfD now. So that there is some. I'm thinking, you know, in France you have surveys that people who are thinking authoritarian in a way and supporting Le Pen, you know, that there's always like 20% of the population since the 80s until today who have supported the kind of attitudes of Le Pen. And there can be similar surveys in Germany, but they weren't anywhere in the public, and so I'm afraid they have chances to reorganize in a way, and you know, if you. You know that old, you've probably all heard that way of saying, well, you know, Hitler was bad, but he did build the Autobahn in Germany. You know, that was something everybody used to say. Today, for me and for young, it's totally unacceptable to say that. But there is, of course, a danger that this kind of, you know, if you listen to what these AfD people are saying, and not only the most radical ones, their leaders in Berlin have called Nazism shit of a bird, or bird's shit, or how do you say, Doug? I mean, it's a terrible expression. It's like Le Pen, who's called the Auschwitz détail d'histoire.
Detail of history.
Yes.
Yeah. Trying to minimize it.
Of course. And we are there again, you know, where we would never think during a long period of time, we would never think it possible, somebody like Le Pen, making fun of these things, that he would be able to do that in Germany. It was just impossible to think that. And then Halle, of course, these events in Halle this year, there were anti-Semitic expressions in Germany. You could find them always when you were looking, but that somebody is capable to do this kind of anti-Semitic attack, feeling that he's supported by people around him, that he puts it in the media and that is something we have not witnessed since 1945. Even if you don't want to generalize on that, we just haven't seen that before, and it's like it really kills you in a way as a German that this can happen again.
And a lot of it, I guess, is spurred right by economic distress. Right now, you have Germany in a situation again where it's still the economic powerhouse, but it's a faltering economy. They've had, definite bumps lately.
And these things go together, don't they? Sort of a blame game, finger pointing.
And look, and in Berlin, Nick Spicer alluded to it also, the refugee issue and immigration issues right now, which have accelerated right now this sense of disenchantment, a sense of resentment. He mentioned the sense of the fear almost of the other. The irony with the Berlin Wall, obviously, as we were saying in the very beginning, was a wall built to keep people from getting out, from escaping, and yet today's walls are to prevent people from getting in, and more, even if it's a metaphorical wall. There are, concrete walls, and then there are just barbed wires, but the idea being keep people out as opposed to keep people in. So I think these are the two, the economic distress and the displacement of populations. So the Berlin Wall isn't running down the center of Berlin right now, but you have the Mediterranean right now, which is a new sort of metaphorical Berlin Wall where, you could look at just the past several months and, even now, even though the numbers of immigrants coming to southern Europe, you still have these treacherous, life-defying journeys, and you still have hundreds dying, if not thousands, on those journeys trying to get into Fortress Europe, as it's often been called.
Sure. Clearly a lot of Germany has a long way to come still by the sounds of what we're hearing these last 30 years. Many of the gaps have been narrowed, but gaps persist to this day. I want to pick up on a different point, though, to wrap up, because that ceremony in Berlin has now ended. And when the Berlin Wall fell, East Germany and much of what it stood for ceased to exist, as we've been saying, and residents of the former East, they went to the garbage dump to get rid of tens of thousands of tons of furniture, household items, everyday goods, which were then replaced immediately by products from the West. But 30 years on, some of those East German items are back in fashion, and they don't come cheap. A France 24 team went to find out more.
The German Democratic Republic is a country you can only visit in a museum now to see what an East German apartment looked like and the objects and style of an everyday bygone life.
It's interesting to think that all these designs were replicated so many times.
I love the colors. It really takes you back to another era.
But a few people still live with the everyday objects of East Germany. In his Berlin apartment, Günther Höhne is proud of a collection unique in Germany.
It's a luxury item now.
After the wall fell, this former journalist specialized in design raced to save what he felt were heritage items, while his fellow citizens wanted nothing more than to be rid of them.
People had no idea that these objects were really good. All they wanted to get were new items. And that's when we started to see mountains of things people were throwing out onto the street. You could just walk or drive by and pick them up.
Most of his collection is on display in museums right now. But 30 years after the fall of the wall, East German products are coming back. In this specialized shop in Schwerin, East German running shoes are all the rage.
These shoes have become cult items, and we sell them as far away as Japan.
Shoes, teddy bears, and dishes all now sell for hundreds of euros. Quite apart from the nostalgia factor, the quality of the products also helps them sell.
People realize now that some things were really good back then, and they should have kept them. It's something we've all experienced. You go through 4 hair dryers while your grandma's from this period still works fine.
Of the 700 one-time East German brands, only 17% are now on sale in Germany.
Okay, so there are some examples of what is called nostalgia for the days of East Germany. Ambassador, you were one of the few people at this table who actually went inside East Berlin. I mean, does any of that in the report make you feel nostalgic? The cars, the products? I mean, does any of that ring true to you?
I think nostalgia has to do with identity. I mean, it's for Eastern Germany and for Germans today who lived in that part of Germany, it means a relation, a sentimental relation with some object, with some. At that time, there were people from the West who could travel, who would go to the East to buy a few things, in particular about porcelain from Meissen, pieces which were almost smuggled. And so, but I think what is very interesting in this nostalgia is this need for every citizen to have a relationship with the past and with objects which make his surroundings, his comfort. And this is perhaps a challenge that we have today. Why those people in Thuringia don't vote anymore for CDU or for SPD? SPD has gone down. CDU has left 11% of the percentage of the votes because they don't feel today at home in some way. They feel that they have lost control on a lot of things. And in Germany, as in France, as in Europe, we have this big problem. It's a problem, it's certainly an economic problem. We feel that the center of the world has moved away from Europe, from us. Second, it's a political feeling that we don't pull the strings anymore, our strings. And maybe we can solve that by giving some more ambition to what we are doing. To instead of looking at Thuringia or at some parts of France or of Europe, we should look at the world, the challenge that we are facing, and the challenge are big. And what you mentioned about the interview of President Macron a few days ago in The Economist is that, after all, he's asked this big question. What are the challenges today of the European? If we don't meet the challenges, we will be left on the side of the road. And if we give such an ambition to our citizens, maybe there is a change, that there is a motivation, there is a new attachment to their democracy, to what they want.
All right, so a lot of, a day like today providing a lot of opportunities for reflection, looking back 30 years, but also looking forwards and thinking about those gaps, those inequalities that exist. Although they're diminishing, fractures still remain in Germany today. Thank you very much. You've had the last word. Bernard de Montferrand, the former French ambassador to Germany, thank you for joining us. To my left as well, Georg Blumer, the Paris correspondent for Die Zeit newspaper. Thank you very much to you. Thank you to our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert. And thank you to you for watching.